Now, the next speaker is a colleague of mine, Ed Schwartz, who is the Chief Security Officer of RSA. Ed Schwartz came to RSA via the NetWitness acquisition. He was one of the founders of NetWitness. He was the CISO of NetWitness as well. Before, he was the Chief Technology Officer and other executive positions for the last 20 years. So please welcome Ed Schwartz.
Thanks very much. Such a pleasure to hear that previous speech because it aligns so nicely with what we're seeing and also what Kurt talked about earlier as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about a concept called intelligence-driven security operations because it really is about what was discussed by Misha and others of knowing your adversary. How do we begin to know more about them than they know about us? Because it seems like they have the other hand. If you don't believe this is true, you shouldn't even be in this room. There are significant gaps in security today. And I guess the question is, what do we look like to our adversaries? I mean, if you had to draw a picture of that and say, well, you know, how does our network look in the face of hacktivists or cyber criminals or state-sponsored people, what would that look like? And, you know, this is kind of the picture that I see. Most of us have built this notion of defense in depth, reacting to different types of things, whether it's viruses or worms or what have you, and we've built these perimeters that are basically completely worthless. Everything we try to do is based on some notion of foreknowledge of attack. I think Kurt talked about this 80%, you know, and it's really interesting, and it's the basic plumbing we should be doing. But unfortunately, in most cases, the adversaries that Misha talked about, that others spoke about today, focusing on that which is the unknown, you know, that which we don't really understand, that which we have to develop a much more advanced capability to figure out in some way. Last year, the Ponemon Institute did a study of 12,000 security folks in the US and in Europe and asked them a bunch of simple questions. But one of them was, for those things that you can't prevent or detect, how long does it take you to ultimately find it? And if you look at where this shakes out, you know, it was somewhere between 1 week and 60 days. Now, for those of you that are not one of the hackers that Misha just talked about and are sitting in this room for positive reasons, I would ask you, if I gave you between 1 week and 60 days and a lot of resources, what could you do to an adversary's networks if you had free time to do it? I would assume you could do quite a bit. So, and these statistics, I think, are not really the truth. I think it's a lot worse than this because that's people who have actually figured out what's going on versus lots of folks that never, ever figure out what's really going on. Prevention is inadequate as a strategy. I mean, those organizations that are thinking, oh, if only I could just stop the bad things from happening to me, the world would be better. You can't. I mean, you can't stop missiles from flying in. You can't stop certain things from happening in traditional warfare. So you've got to imagine that no matter what you do, there's going to be a certain level of exploitation. So how do we begin to plan for that? And how do we begin to start creating an environment in which we can limit the damage to something that is reasonable and manageable for us? And that's really what it's all about in this space. The problem is the philosophy that we've been taking. You know, we said, well, if there's two guys that show up at the door and they've got black ski masks and flashlights, then that's bad and that's what we should be focused on. But the real reality is that we've got a stadium full of people and they're all dressed in shorts and t-shirts and they all look like they're okay. And we've got this mathematical challenge of trying to figure out which is the person that has the explosives tucked in their underwear or whatever it is when they look normal and they look okay. And that's a mathematical problem. And that's a problem that requires other skill sets, just as was discussed earlier. So we need more data, and we need more analytics, and we need different skills brought to the table. One of the things that we're doing in terms of changing our model, and this happened after I came to RSA after the security breach they had last year, was really putting the adversary first. And I think to the point that Misha made earlier, we need to be creating a matrix of who are all these folks and really starting to gain intelligence into who are they, what's the likelihood of attack, what are they after, and understanding that we can't protect everything equally, nor should we spend the time doing it. For example, if you had asked me earlier this year if I thought that we were a target of Anonymous at EMC, I would have said, no, I don't really think that that's a high profile for us. But then, you know, a couple of months ago we had some legislation that we supported, and then all of a sudden we have a target on our back. So it's a changing landscape, constantly evolving, and we have to be planning for changes, and we have to be reactive, and we have to be ready to make those changes. So as you think about these adversaries, you have to think, well, what are their capabilities? And what means do I have to prevent them? What means do I have to detect them? How can I gain intelligence into that? Kurt talked about the kill chain, and this is sort of another angle on that, but you know, the idea that along the different phases of what an adversary is doing, you may be at different levels of maturity where you can understand some level of operational intelligence about how they view your attack surface from a public-facing perspective, understand perhaps delivery or weaponization. But most organizations, unfortunately, fall way on the right side of this, where they don't really even understand an attack until it's deep inside their network, interacting with their data, or they're seeing catastrophic losses. And I guess what I'd call on the left side of the slide is hope. You know, hoping that defensive solutions work out, hoping that everything's okay. But the interesting part about all this is as the cost to remediate problems goes up for everybody, the attacker also has an increased cost because the exposure level goes up, the cost to the attacker goes up. They move away from automated processes, move away from bots and different types of approaches, and as they move to lateral movement and other types of directed attacks will become much more visible if you're doing the right things, if you've built the right processes, if you have the right data, if you have the right people behind all this. So there's this sweet spot which I think is underinvested in our world, where there's a high detection potential and where we have a great opportunity in this area. An opportunity for innovators to build startup technologies, to build service companies, an opportunity for us to build process, an opportunity for us to succeed in terms of winning over the adversaries. So I think there's three characteristics I want to talk about in the time that I have left in terms of what I've been doing at RSA and what I would suggest to all of you to think about in terms of how you view technology, how you view security programs, how you view approaches that you're going to take in terms of talking to companies like us, in terms of your own internal programs. Contextual, risk-based, and agile. Those are three characteristics that I think are important to any program today. Let's talk about risk-based first. If any of you have taken security classes or studied this or taken ridiculous certifications like CISSP, which I have, you've probably seen this equation, risk equals threats times assets times vulnerabilities. This is an unsolvable equation because, first of all, let's take threat. If any of you have figured out how to quantify threat, please enlighten me because I can't figure it out. Generally what I do is I plug in a value from Star Trek here, like light years or parsecs or something like that, just to put a number in. You know, if you put 0, you negate the equation. At least that's as far as I've gotten in math in life. But the rest of it is vulnerabilities. If I have 23,000 vulnerabilities today and then I scan the network tomorrow, it appears that I have more. I patch those and then Adobe comes out with some new flash file thing. Is that good or bad? These are meaningless things to me. So what I'd rather be doing instead is looking at what are those mission-specific material assets that matter to me and that I have any chance whatsoever of protecting due to the way I've created my network infrastructure, the way I've created containerization, virtualization, the way I've organized my mobility, cloud-based assets. How does that relate to the attack surface? One of the other speakers talked about what does your social presence look like, your social media presence, and so on. What does that entire attack surface look like, and how does it relate to those assets? What does the insider threat factor look like? And then which are the adversaries that want those assets, and what are their capabilities? That's an interesting equation, one that I can take back and relate to my own capabilities and what I can do about it. Contextual. most organizations today in the US are not focused on this. For example, most organizations, the last network technology that they've bought is intrusion detection. And so they're analyzing logs and trying to figure out, why aren't the logs telling me that all these criminal groups are coming in here and stealing all my shit? Well, yeah, because the logs are not attenuated to find all this bad stuff. You need a lot more data, a lot more data. And so what does that look like? And so the obligatory quote from the Chinese philosopher, when the trees move, the enemy is advancing. We Americans do actually like quoting Chinese philosophers, by the way. Where did Misha go? Anyway, but what this means to me is that it's about knowing your network more. Know your adversary, know your network. What does our network tell us? The logs only tell us a portion of the information, but there's all kinds of stuff out there, right? There's physical security data, there's HR data, there's full packet data, there's asset management information. I mean, think of the universe of what your network would tell you if you could organize it, put a security context to it, and then start performing statistical analysis or analytics on it. But then there's a universe of external information too, from the government, from market sectors, from vendors, from others, open source information. And if you start to distill that and fuse that with your internal information, imagine the results you could get. Kurt talked about the Lockheed's kill chain methodology and the work that Mike Clopper did on this, and I just want to mention that because I think it is a really great methodology here. And one of the things from there which is really cool is this notion of old school versus sort of new school approaches. If you look how most of us are trying to detect adversarial phases in the kill chain, you'll see on the left we're looking for people scanning us and doing opportunistic attacks or network layer attacks or looking to exploit vulnerable protocols or things of that sort. That's not what's going on today. It's open source based, targeted, layer 7, all of these things, and we haven't attenuated either our technologies or processes to look for this. It's a lot more difficult, it requires a lot more data, it requires a different approach. Multi-source intelligence, what does that mean to you? It means knowing the adversary, but it means you've got to look out in the world and say, who out there has information that might be valuable to me? I know Misha was complaining that, well, really haven't gotten it together in the world and figured out the adversary. That's not going to happen in any time soon. So we can't sit and wait for governments and others to figure this stuff out for us. If you're in a private company, you've got to go out and figure it out yourself. Or if you're a government agency, you've got to go out and figure it out yourself. Work with your vendors, work with your partners, create one-off data sharing relationships. I mean, that's what I've done. Where there are vendors that can provide you answers, great. But go out and benchmark yourself against other organizations that are friendly to you, that it might be doing a better job or an equal job or a lesser job, and say, how do you do this? And can we share information with you? Because that's the start of an ecosystem. At least begin there and then see where you wind up. I put this up here because this is an example of what big data can do for you. This idea of insider threat management. I mean, what is an insider anyway? Because I don't understand inside and outside anymore, but it could be an end user that is maybe a spy or a rogue person or whatever. It could be a device that's compromised or a process. So what if I take big data, capturing all this internal and external information, and then I put a risk scoring methodology to it to intersect all these vectors. And I say something like, well, I've got a contractor with 30 days left on his contract, inserts a USB drive in a PC while connected to my corporate VPN from an IP address that's not known to be a home address or not my corporate. If you think about this, how many different vectors am I putting together, pieces of data, databases, to come to that conclusion, and should I be able to recognize that action within moments of occurring? Of course the answer is yes, and it's many pieces of information. But this is very possible today. Imagine if you start combining and fusing all of this data, the conclusions you can come to. Finally, agility. What does that mean? Well, it means you have to have these sort of 4 basic ideas. Comprehensive visibility, and to me that means get everything, know everything that's going on. You have to have analytics that are open. Open support of standards, open support of any kinds of data you're going to bring in, ability to connect systems together, to do link analysis. Actionable intelligence. You need it now. If you're going to wait 8 hours for a query to come back to you, you're in deep trouble. And you have to optimize that to your incident management. If you're doing incident response the same way you did it 2 years ago, you're going to fail. You have to start thinking about architecture. What does the back end look like? What is the entirety of the storage situation? How do you normalize hundreds of data elements so that a user ID is a user ID across hundreds of systems? And that's a data schema issue. You have to think about combining analytics so they're not 10 different analytics platforms but one, and then how all of this works together. And how does it work back to your preventative systems? And how do you fuse and enrich that information using all kinds of threat intelligence across the life cycle of information? Finally, people. We need better analytics skills. We need big picture thinking. How do we get all of these characteristics? This is a picture of what my team looks like in terms of our incident response team. Basic single pane of glass all the way up to very detailed, highly specialized analytics skills, people that are writing code. We talked about anthropological skills earlier. We have all of these types of skills on the team. So, in closing, what I'd like to just remind you, prevention is impossible. So think about reallocation of resources. Move away from spending everything on prevention, and what should the balance be between prevention and detection and preemption. Focus on the adversary and what they're up to, and understand them better, and tie that to your material assets and the mission that you have. Security is a big data problem, and you've got a plan for that. If terabytes and petabytes scare you, get over that right now and focus how you can fuse intelligence into the problem. You have to have at least these 3 ideas behind everything you do. If you don't think differently about this problem, you will fail, and you're going to lose out to these adversaries that we've been talking about. Thank you very much.